So let me begin by kind of outlaying what farmland ponds are. For those of you who are unfamiliar with them, you've probably seen them. They're often found in agricultural fields at the edge or maybe in the middle. And they've actually been shown that they can be ideal habitat for a variety of aquatic and terrestrial species. Several studies earlier in the 2010s have shown that that these ponds can indeed be rich sites for biodiversity, but more often than not, they're not meeting that biodiversity potential. There are various reasons for that. Some of it is fertilizer runoff causing nutrient buildup in these fresh waters, which promotes algae growth over plant growth. Part of it is infilling. Farmers and landowners might feel like they need more land to grow their crops or feed their cattle, and so they fill them in. But one of the ones that we have studied at UCL as part of the Pond Restoration Research Group is what we term pond terrestrialization. Now that's an interesting word. Let me explain that a little bit more, that concept of pond terrestrialization. Another word that we use is overgrown ponds. So ponds, like many other still water bodies such as lakes, actually follow a pathway where they begin their life in quite an open state, but then they begin to be colonized by more and more plants and that start building up sediment around them, and this eventually starts filling in the water body, and so they kind of give way to what's known as a wooded wetland. So this is actually a very natural process. However, farmland ponds are largely man-made. So if you want to retain a pond, it means you have to go in there and kind of keep cutting things back in order to keep it open and to keep woody plants from dominating too much and beginning to fill in the pond basin with leaves and sediment. And largely, historically, they were kept open. We know that there are records as far back as the 1500s. Tusser, in his book about husbandry and farm management in the 1500s, wrote about digging out ponds for their sediment. Their rich sediment was good to spread out on the fields as a type of fertilizer, but it also kept the pond open for other things like fishing and other just forms of pleasure, not often that farmers couldn't often enjoy, but they were there. However, this management largely stopped after agricultural intensification began, which was mostly after the Second World War. And this has led to an abundance of overgrown ponds. So farmers, the number of farmers in our countryside went down, the number of laborers went down, and their focus was all on production. So they didn't really have a lot of free time on their hands. So these ponds became overgrown out of neglect. And let me show you exactly what happens when a pond becomes overgrown. So here's a graph from a paper that talked about birds and birds using ponds, but it's great for this purpose. So here is a nice open pond that is open to air and light and isn't dominated by woody vegetation. This includes willow, bramble, maybe some alder, but you see there's a lot of different types of pond plants in here. You can see the clear water, and so this becomes a wonderful place for biodiversity. Insects that are aquatic, but then they hatch and start flying out are great for birds and bats, and so you'll often see them visiting an open pond. There's lots of different types of microhabitats, which are great for not just plants, but birds, macroinvertebrates, fish, otters, all sorts of animals make their life here. And as I'll be talking a bit later, it's also great for pollinators. So if you go from this state where you kind of neglect and you let the woody vegetation start dominating, you end up with this situation here. So here you can't even see the pond basin. It's completely dominated by scrub trees. So this is blackthorn, hawthorn. We've got some alder and willow in there. Because the adult insects like dragonflies can't see the water as they fly over, they don't tend to lay their eggs there. So you're not getting a lot of larvae coming up. Therefore, you don't have as many bird species visiting these places, or bats. You don't have, you see here a lot of grass. This tends to dominate. Again, the landowners, the farmers aren't really bothered, and they, if there is a margin here, this little buffer zone, it's not taken care of very well, and so you don't have a lot of flowers. So it's also not very, as I'll show later, you don't tend to see a lot of pollinators around here as well. They just seem very quiet places compared to these nice open ponds. So part of the pond restoration research group is to understand this difference, and why is it that us coming in and creating some disturbance actually benefits biodiversity. Part of that is looking at the difference between management and restoration. We term management as kind of occasional, maybe once or twice a decade, coming in and coppicing some trees or removing some of the scrub. Perhaps you might come in and do some partial sediment removal or emergent plant removal, so, you know, things like bulrushes that are becoming a bit too dominant and are really starting to silt up the pond basin. Sometimes it's desirable to remove some of that, but not all of it. But and that's certainly been shown to be quite good. If you ever have a chance, there's a great paper by my supervisor, Professor Carl Sayer, again, who leads the pond restoration research group. This was done in 2012. And again, he has another paper in 2013 in British Wildlife that talks about the benefits of management for pond biodiversity. It's really quite good. So management's quite good. But as I've said, most of our ponds in the UK and certainly in Norfolk are actually in this overgrown state because they've been left for so long. So what my supervisor hypothesized is, well, we can mimic creating a new pond, but actually not creating a new pond. You're just resetting it back to an early successional state by going in and doing a hard cutback of the scrub. We don't remove all of it, but it's typically around the north side of the pond. We'll tend to leave a few trees and some scrub, but we remove a lot of the scrub that grows around these ponds, and then we dredged the sediment out in order to expose the seed bank. And so it does look quite catastrophic at first, but as in this case here, there's actually no water in the pond basin currently because all of these trees at the end of the summer have sucked all the water out of the pond basin. So we often do this in the early fall or sometimes in midwinter when things are kind of quiet and asleep, so we're not disturbing too much. And the work that Carl and some of my other colleagues have done has shown that this is actually quite beneficial to pond biodiversity, particularly aquatic biodiversity in plants and aquatic invertebrates. It's quite good for those species. Richness goes up, abundance goes up. So the data is there, and it's, while it might look harsh, within a year, it actually looks like a beautiful, lovely pond. So that's the pond side. So now let me kind of talk a bit about the pollinator side. So you've probably heard in the news that pollinators aren't doing too well. Probably bees have been in the news a lot, maybe butterflies, maybe moths. All of our pollinators are suffering in the countryside, especially here in the UK. And again, this is in large part due to what we call agricultural intensification. This is this production-driven spray everything with fertilizer, spray everything with pesticides, and it's all about produce, which is good because we do need to feed everyone, but it's really harsh for biodiversity. And this has led, this drive in the last 70, 80 years has driven the decline of several important pollinating insect populations. Let's see. So this includes bees and wasps, includes lepidopterans, those are the butterflies and the moths, and it also includes hoverflies, which are the bee mimics. They look like bees, but they're actually flies. So they're all under stress, and several species are declining. And part of the largest drivers of the decline of these species is due to habitat loss and a loss of plant diversity. You can imagine as we go in and we have monoculture crops, this means a loss of habitat, and we have more of these big giant fields. This means that there's less habitat for wildlife, and there's fewer types of plant species around for these pollinators to visit or to lay their larvae on, because again, the larvae need to often, like in butterflies and moths, they need plants to feed on as well. So this is some data that was put out by DEFRA in 2021. So we see that moth species have suffered some of the severest declines since about the late 1960s, early 1970s. They've had a continuous decline in terms of abundance, as well as several species becoming extinct in the UK. Butterflies have kind of gone back and forth. They seem to be doing a little better in the late 80s, early 90s, but they have declined since, and they're struggling in years since. Hoverflies have experienced a continuous decline in their species numbers since 1990, and then all pollinators have continuously shown a decline again since the early 90s, and so this is quite concerning, because we rely on these pollinators to do so much for us in terms of pollinating the plants that leads to our food, as well as being part of the food chain. And so I wondered, if farmland ponds are great for aquatic biodiversity, and as well as some studies that are showing that they're really good for bird biodiversity in farmland, are they good for pollinators? Research hadn't been done before when I started my PhD, and so this little red question is what drove my PhD. Do pollinators and farmland ponds have a shared conservation interest? Meaning, does pond management and restoration improve pollinator diversity and abundance? And then also, if they are at ponds, what are adult pollinators feeding on at ponds? What is driving them towards ponds? And so those were kind of the two research questions driving my PhD project. So I had 9 study ponds in Norfolk, North Norfolk, which is a very beautiful area to conduct your field work. It's very rural, very different from where I'm from. I'm from New York City. I came here from New York City to do my PhD. Anyway, so we have 3 ponds here that are long-term managed, and these are ponds that kind of inspired my PhD supervisor into studying ponds, because these ponds were so good compared to ponds in neighboring land that just were, again, overgrown. But these ponds that have been managed by the landowner over the last 40 plus years were quite good, very different compared to the overgrown ponds. And then, so up here in this area near Holt, we had 3 overgrown ponds and 3 ponds that we had restored as part of the Norfolk Ponds project. So 9 ponds in total to kind of compare and contrast. And the overgrown ponds were what we would term a control group. So if we just left things as they were, how do these 2 pond category, to the restored ponds and the long-term managed ponds, how do they compare to these overgrown ponds. Some of the method that I used, since I wanted to understand what was driving, if pollinators were visiting these types of ponds, what was it that was bringing them there? I did a wildflower survey, and so this was done the first week of the month during the growing season, March through September in 2016 and 2017. I recorded all terrestrial plants and aquatic plants that were in bloom and available for pollinators to visit. And I ranked them according to their abundance. So were they kind of a dominant flower? Were they really abundant? Were they frequent? Or were they rare? So I did that once a month. And then I concurrently, at the same time, I was also doing pollinator monitoring. And so I had a few different ways to see what kind of pollinators were there. I had these pan traps there, which attract the pollinator and catch them, and then you can identify what's there. I used time-lapse photography, so I had these time-lapse cameras that were aimed at flower patches and took pictures about every 30 seconds to see what insects were visiting the flowers. And then I also had a visual observation where I just kind of circled the pond and noted what was visiting the flowers or flying about the pond. And then finally, for moths, which are a fairly understudied group of pollinators, I use light traps to capture them at night, because obviously most of them are active at night and not during the day, making it much harder to see them and record them. So I also created some food webs based on what I found. And so just a brief introduction to how I constructed those. So the daytime food web, so these are bees, butterflies, hoverflies, that was composed of what I observed directly, the insects visiting while I was circling the pond, as well as from the time-lapse data that I obtained. For the nocturnal food web, the moths, what I did was actually I swabbed the pollen off of the moths once I captured them from their body and their proboscis, and then I used that pollen that I swabbed from them. I identified the pollen. I could identify the plants that the pollen is, because pollen is actually, you can identify right to plant species if the pollen is of good quality, and then I can then use that as a way to say, okay, this is what the moths are visiting. So that's a bit of the methods there that I used. So here's some of the results. I'm going to start off with wildflower richness. So this is in a paper that I published last year, Insect Conservation and Diversity. And what it shows is that the long-term managed ponds had significantly more plant species than the overgrown ponds. Recently restored ponds were also quite high in plant species when compared to the overgrown ponds, but it wasn't a statistically significant difference, but still quite good. So this means that mathematically, long-term managed ponds have more, significantly more plant species than the overgrown ponds. So already we're off to a good start. And then when I kind of did this analysis, don't be too taken aback by this graph here. When I did an analysis of the types of plants found at the different groups of ponds, what I found was that the reason why the number of plant species was so much higher at long-term managed ponds and recently restored ponds is the type of habitats those plant species inhabited. So these are the long-term managed ponds, and then these are the restored ponds, and then over here are the overgrown ponds. What we see with the majority of the long-term managed ponds as well as the restored ponds is that they have plants that are inhabiting a range of habitats. The purely aquatic, meaning they might be fully submerged, but then they have a flower stalk coming up out of the water, or they're kind of growing at the edge. Lots of plants that grow at the edge, like water mint, which I'll talk about a bit more. Plants that can live both in dry and wet conditions, So they're kind of, again, near the edge, but a little further back from the water. And then plants that are growing right out near the edge in the drier parts of the buffer. And then, of course, the woody vegetation, the trees. So plants are coming from all different types of habitat here, whereas overgrown ponds are really just dominated by these last two, these herbaceous arable plants, such as like chamomile, thistles and such, and then the woody vegetation that is common to all of these ponds. So already a very different wildflower community is available at managed and restored ponds. So this is just a quick overview. The overgrown ponds were dominated by scrub, willow, blackthorn, hawthorn, and some bramble, as well as some arable weeds, whereas long-term managed ponds had a gradient extending from the pond water column, what we call the macrophytes, and the emergent area, such as the bulrushes, to many different arable weeds and some scrub. There was also lots of bramble found at these long-term managed ponds, probably because disturbance encourages bramble growth. Recently restored ponds had a very similar gradient to these long-term managed ponds, but fewer arable weed species. So now let's talk about pollinator diversity. So for this can also be found in the same paper, Insect Conservation and Diversity. Bee species, so when you look at all bee and wasp species, the number of species was significantly higher than overgrown ponds. So both long-term managed and restored ponds had significantly higher bee and wasp species richness than overgrown ponds. Hoverfly species was a bit more mixed. It was kind of all over the place. And there's some interesting questions as to why that might be. Part of it is just the fact that maybe most of them are quite generalist species, so they don't really care what type of habitat. The different types of species don't really care what type of habitat they are in. That's one of the hypotheses that have arisen from this study. So, and then please, this is a different graph that wasn't published, so please just ignore these two sides. But butterfly species were higher at recent restored ponds, but there was no significant difference with the overgrown ponds. Moth species, again, very similar, a bit better at recent restored ponds, but no significant differences. And a bit more needs to be explored there. When you look at the abundance, so the number of individuals in each of these groups, what we see is, while there are no significant differences, in each case, bees, hoverflies, wasps, butterflies, and moths all are much more abundant at the managed and the restored ponds when compared to the overgrown ponds. So restoration and management, it can be concluded, is good for improving pollinator richness and abundance at these sites. So when you kind of look at the community that makes up these different communities, it was at overgrown ponds, it was fairly simplistic for butterflies, bees, wasps, and hoverflies. The moth community, however, was a bit more complex. This is probably because a lot of woodland species were found at these sites. Long-term managed ponds were much more complex for butterflies, social bees, and other bee and wasp species, as well as hoverflies. However, the moth community was simpler than the overgrown and recently restored ponds. I'm not quite sure what that means there. There could be some other things at play there, and I haven't been able to quite explore that a bit more in detail, but I do hope to soon. Finally, the restored ponds, they were the most complex for butterfly, bee, social bee, and other bee and wasp species and hoverflies, and they were similarly complex to the overgrown ponds. Now here's where I get into the food webs that I constructed. So these are the daytime flying species, the bees and wasps, the butterflies, and the hoverflies. This was based again off of the flowers that I observed them visiting either directly or through the time-lapse photos that I took. Now here again, you have quite a busy bit of information thrown at you. Please don't be too taken aback. I'll try and keep it as simple as possible. So this is long-term managed ponds, restored ponds, overgrown ponds. On the left side of each food web are the plant species, and I've got the most abundantly visited plant species named here. On the right side of each food web are the pollinator species, and I've named those that are most abundantly visiting flowers. So, and what I really want to highlight here is the middle here, this number of connections. What you can see is that there's a lot of connections here at the long-term managed ponds and the restored ponds, and fewer here at the overgrown ponds. And there's a lot more different species. I really want to highlight this Mentha aquatica, that's water mint. And there's some other aquatic species here that are highly visited by pollinators, all types of pollinators. So they were quite important, whereas that was absent at the overgrown pond. So you already see that there's a difference in the types of plants being visited and how important those aquatic plants were to a lot of the different flower visitors there. So what we see is when you kind of deconstruct those food webs into words, what we see here is that long-term managed had lots of different types of plant species involved and lots of different types of pollinators involved. And the same at recently restored ponds, lots of different types of plants, lots of different types of pollinators, and recently restored ponds were seen as the most complex of the food webs when each was compared. The overgrown ponds here, the terrestrialized ponds, they were much more simple, very few plant species involved, and they were dominated by kind of just your generic social bees, the bumblebees, the honeybee, one very common hoverfly species, and then a few other species were involved there. Now let's talk about the moth. So this was a fairly new thing to do. Again, as I said, moths haven't been well studied as pollinators. There was a little bit of work coming out at the same time that I was doing this. So this was quite new and interesting to do to understand them. And I'm still working on getting this data published. But what I found is, so this is the pollen that I found on them. So over here, again, so this is the overgrown, this is a bit reversed from the last set of food webs. So the overgrown ponds are over here, and then we got long-term managed and the restored ponds here. Again, and then on this side, we have the moth species, and then on the right side here, we have the pollen of the plant species that I found. What we see here is that the overgrown ponds and the recent restored ponds have a fairly similar complexity to them. Lots of different plant species being carried by the moths when compared to the long-term managed ponds. Again, this has something to do with the fact that there were fewer moth species found here. So this is having a lead in. So this needs a bit more investigation, which I haven't had time to do yet, but it was a very interesting result. But again, it shows that, for one, it shows that moths are actually really taking part in pollen transport. There's definitely a part of pollination processes at ponds and within our countryside. So this is one of the first studies to show that. But it also shows that management doesn't necessarily work for all species. We might need to do a few more studies to tease out some of the nuances of this, but in some instances, perhaps management isn't as good for all species. So that's an interesting takeaway here. Again, just highlighting the complexity here, where the managed ponds for moths are not as good for their food webs when compared to overgrown or restored ponds. When we look again, kind of condensing it down to words, we see that the long-term managed ponds had they had a moderate amount of plant species involved in having their pollen being transported, and a number of different moth species, but restored ponds had the greatest amount of plant species involved and a pretty good number of moth species involved. Now, while overgrown ponds only had 2 types of plant species, plant communities that were pulled from, they had the most number of moths working in their food web. So this, just to wrap up all that information and hopefully some take-home messages for you. Firstly, forage plants are significantly richer at managed ponds. Pond management and restoration benefits the flower community in the countryside, which in turn benefits the pollinator community. So pollinator communities are linked to pond category. They have unique communities based on whether they're managed, whether they're restored, or whether they're overgrown. It must be admitted that most pollinator observations that I made were of generalist species. This is fairly common throughout much of the pollinator work being done right now, is the fact that we've lost so many species that the only ones that can survive in the countryside are ones that can visit a lot of different types and don't specialize in any one type of plant species, which is a sad thing, but so we need to protect as many of those generalist species as possible. The food webs for the daytime and the nighttime pollinators have distinctive components between the different categories of management. So they're unique, they stand apart, and it must be admitted that food webs generally become more complex with pond management, but not in every single case. Because of that, these differences in communities and the food webs, it's likely that a mosaic of ponds at differing stages of management is likely best. So right now, what we have are the overgrown ponds dominating the landscape, and then we have a few managed ponds and we have a few restored ponds, but the overgrown ponds are largely dominating. And so what we're advocating for is not that we go in and restore all the ponds, but we want to have lots of different ponds at these different types of stages of management and growth, because that will ultimately lift the biodiversity much higher, because not all plants and animals prefer one management type. Some of them definitely prefer one category over another. So having lots of different types of pond categories is really good. So some future work with this is trying to understand the role of pond individuality. I categorize these ponds together, but sometimes some of these ponds are quite unique and individual. So we need to kind of tease that out as we try to understand how they operate within the wider landscape. We also need to compare pollinator observations as well as the food webs that we've constructed with hedgerows and other semi-natural habitats in our farmland. We think that they might be better. Certainly some preliminary work that I've done has shown that ponds are actually better than hedgerows for plants and therefore pollinators, but this needs to be more scientifically investigated, as well as comparing them with things like woodland and grasslands that are left. Then we also have to understand the seasonality. How does that influence richness, abundance, and the food networks? Most of the activity I saw was either in the late spring or the late summer. So there might be different times when one type of pond is really good for different types of species, and another group of ponds is better at a different time of the year. Certainly that needs to be explored in much more detail. So that's my work, and I always love to thank those who helped me with my work. I really wouldn't have been able to do it without them. And so that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was absolutely fascinating stuff. Brilliant, and so relevant to what we're doing in our project as well. So please, if you like to, if you have any questions, either speak up or put them on the chat, and I'll try and relate those to Richard. One of the comments I thought as we were going through was the dredging thing, and I know I'm very aware that the geologists amongst our project are, and it's been becoming more and more obvious that with an ice age pond in particular, because of the sediments and the recorded history there, when we're saying please don't dredge without consulting and without thinking about it, because quite often a lot of these ponds are ephemeral, and they naturally dry out in the summer, but they still have quite an interesting flora and fauna, particularly if they're nice and open. So that was one, but obviously in some situations it is very much be a useful thing to do.
Yes, I agree. I mean, certainly ice age ponds, I've only just come across them after you contacted me, and I'm really quite interested in them. But from what I can gather, a lot of them, yes, are ephemeral, so they might be a bit seasonal. They tend to be maybe in a bit more open places, or at least woodland places, which is a bit more natural than just letting a pond be overgrown. So I think you're absolutely right in saying that you would need to be very careful about any sort of dredging. In these farmland situations, it's a bit different, because our idea is we don't want to plant any plants. We want this to be as natural as possible. And some work done by some of my other PhD colleagues at the time showed that the plants that were coming up from these restored sites were original to the site, and that their seeds was coming from the seed bank. So what we're doing when we're dredging is the fact that all of these leaves and detritus has fallen into the pond, that covers up the seed bank.
Yeah.
And so, but these seeds can actually be viable. We've found for at least some seeds in the case of 150 years or more. So they're, even if they were, the seeds fell to the bottom of the pond 150 years ago, they might still grow back. They just need the right conditions to return to the pond. And dredging that helps expose the seed bank. We advocate the use of someone who knows what they're doing with a digger. You don't just want any person, because we don't, these ponds are kind of lined with the base of marl, so chalky, very thick chalky clay, and that kind of acts as an impermeable barrier usually to prevent all the water from just sinking down into the water table. So we don't want to disturb that marl layer, and we don't remove all the sediment. There's just a nice fine layer of nice black sediment when we're finished with the dredging, because we're just trying to follow the contours of the pond. Absolutely. And we're trying to just get those lovely seeds to have the right conditions, see a bit of light again and a bit of air to be able to start that germination process.
As you were saying there, there's this kind of, there's a difference between the what we call ghost ponds that have been filled in artificially.
Yes.
To remove that would be a very useful thing to do. But I think, I'm guessing that where they filled naturally in an open situation, that might need to be a lot more careful with those.
Lots more careful, and certainly another reason why we do the dredging is, again, all the leaves that get put in. I mean, you have to think of all the number of leaves falling into an overgrown pond is just quite tremendous, and that actually causes the pond basin to become shallower and shallower and shallower. But in the cases where some of these, like the ice age ponds, are actually already quite shallow, you don't really need to disturb that, because if you go in and disturb that, you're probably going to wreck the whole pond and create a completely different environment. So it's very particular to farmland ponds.
Got a question from Selena, who says, has the correlation between moths and bats at ponds been investigated?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. So I actually have a colleague right now. He was a master's student when I was doing my PhD work, but he's now up doing his own PhD, and he's actually looking at bats right now around ponds. And so he's exploring the number of bats based on the different types of whether it's managed, restored, an overgrown pond, but he's also trying to understand their food sources. And moths would obviously play a part of that. So he's ongoing gathering data. I think this year will be a big year for him to gather data. So we'll be looking forward to that. So it's forthcoming, but I don't have any data on correlation as of yet.
Right. No, there's lots of work to be done there. One thing very relevant to the project is we're thinking about ongoing things, and particularly pond champions, so people to take on, take up the cause of Ice Age ponds in future, is how we can encourage and involve people in the monitoring, so sort of citizen science type monitoring. Do you have any thoughts about what volunteers with, I mean, there will be some volunteers with very good identification skills, but I guess a very simple way of recording biodiversity on ponds. I mean, you alluded to some of it in your, I think you've done some of it, and some of them look to me as though might lend themselves to being done by local people, citizen science type things.
Yes, a few years ago we had this thing called the Great Pond Twin Dig, and it was this funded project between Norfolk and Lancashire. And that was a really citizen science driven. And some of them weren't really good with the identification, but what they were really good at is setting up the monitoring equipment. So they go in and they set up the equipment for a while, and then they come back and gather, and then they just report what's been found. They either send you the photo data or whatever, but it gets them involved in the process, and they get to see the wildlife there. They get to see that these ponds change through the seasons. They get to see what kind of pond is really good, and what pond is they can kind of come to expect may not give them.
Oh, you've frozen a bit there.
Them into citizen science is to have, sorry about that, is to have them get involved in the actual gathering of the data, just by setting up the equipment and taking it down, and just quickly going through, making sure that if you're using like time-lapse cameras or wildlife cameras, that there's data there. That gives them a chance to actually see what's there, and then send that forward to the scientists and the researchers to actually go through the data and say, okay, this is that, and I do the identifying if that's not their strong suit. If it is their strong suit, we welcome any sort of taxonomist into the foray, because it is a dying science, taxonomy, and we need lots of people to tell us what it is we're actually looking at.
Yeah, it's also kind of getting us almost a standardized way of doing it, so that it can be comparable, isn't it? Gareth Rees-Roberts asks, were dragonflies recorded?
I didn't do dragonflies myself, but we've done quite a lot of different studies on dragonflies. We have created probably one of the longer data sets of dragonfly time series data sets of dragonflies in this area. I think they've been done every year for lots of the ponds there in Norfolk, every year since 2010 maybe. Yeah. So we have quite a continuous time series data of dragonfly species visiting each pond in the area that we study, which is quite a large area of North Norfolk. And I know my other colleagues have studied the dragonfly larvae, and so we do know certainly that the long-term managed ponds are really great, as well as the restored ponds, for dragonfly species. Lots more species at these sites.
Sure. Yeah. Here we go. Anthony Furness asks, Richard, apart from field and pond flower pollen, did you identify the tree pollen and what importance this had for pollinator species and the results you arrived at?
It's a really good question. So the only tree species that I really got were much more kind of scrub species around the ponds. I didn't find any pollen from trees on the moths. And I think a lot of the reason why that was the case is often so tree pollen is often driven out by the wind. So a lot of trees are wind pollinated rather than insect pollinated. But that doesn't mean that they can't end up on a moth just because a moth just we all have seen moths fly around. They're not very graceful when they fly around. They bump into things, so they could certainly come across tree pollen. But I think what I found was that in a sense, when I caught these moths, and I did have to euthanize them in order to get the pollen off of them, is what we were seeing was their last meals, so to speak. So it was directly visiting it was looking at finding the pollen that they got from the last flowers that they visited, and it all went right down to based on flower pollen.
Yeah.
So I didn't find any kind of wind pollinated species on any of the moths, and I did look for that.
Yeah, I guess it's a strategy of the plant, isn't it? The moths tend to go to the flowers that are designed to spread the pollen in that way.
Yes. Yeah.
Mary Stevenson asks, how much information sharing is there between academic studies and the specialist groups such as the Butterfly Society?
Oh, well, so I sent all of my stuff to Butterfly Conservation, as well, I think the Bumblebee Conservation. I shared it with the local Norfolk Biodiversity Information Service, but it's often up to the scientists to remember to do that.
Yeah.
And sometimes scientists can be very protective of their data, but more and more now what we're nicely seeing, and what I've done with quite a lot of my data, I put it on a data sharing site. So it's there, anyone can visit it. Some stuff might be a bit more particular and you might want to protect it a bit more. But you can, if someone asks nicely and if they give you the reason for it, I'm very willing to share my data. So, but I would actually encourage, and the movement really is more towards scientists sharing it with everyone. And the data needs to be there so that people can use this, because other modelers use the data to create models. Other scientists are looking to find trends in larger regions, larger areas. So it's really good to share the data, because then that can be further analyzed. Plus you can look at it for reproducibility, which is important in science.
I think, and when we've discussed this before, people talk about putting it onto iRecord, which is a good way of
which I use. I love iRecord. Yes.
Yeah. I have a question from Will, who says, "Oh, that's fascinating. I've observed that and read that some aquatic plants are super sources of nectar. For example, hemp agrimony attracts large numbers of hoverflies and marsh thistles. Has been rated as the #1 species for attracting pollinators. I would have thought their presence or absence could have a significant effect on your results." So
is that the rest of the question?
That's sort of almost a statement, Anna.
Yeah. Well, no, I'll go back to the water mint, and I agree with that. I think so water mint was found at one overgrown pond, one managed pond, and one restored pond. And that did actually have an outsized effect on the whole food web for those pond categories, because they were so attractive to the pollen, all different types of pollinators. They were, if the pond had water mint, a sizable bed of water mint, which kind of just grows right at the edge of the pond. So it's what we consider an emergent plant. So it's not usually right in the water column, but it's right at the edge, and it really loves really damp soil. And it flowers in about in Norfolk, it was about mid to late August. when it was in flower, or I'm sorry, the start of August towards the end of August, and it would just be heaving and buzzing with pollinators. It was just a joy to see, and so it definitely has it can have an outsized effect and kind of make you have to qualify that, but you couldn't find water mint at the overgrown ponds. It just wasn't there. And so I think what that points to is, while it might have had an outsized effect, what it points to is management or restoration creates the conditions that are good for that water mint to be there. So if it does grow there, it will be really good for biodiversity. And if we just increase the number of ponds in the landscape that can grow water mint, it would be absolutely wonderful for the countryside.
It's a really simple, relatively simple way of increasing biodiversity generally, isn't it? As you say.
I agree with that. Water mint's excellent for attracting pollinators as well. You know, I've kind of observed it, and I did actually plant some empigriminy in my garden pond, and it's expanded and expanded each year. It seems to pull in migratory species of hoverfly and things. So you really get the impression that it's actually pulling species in from the wider countryside. So, you know, I sort of rate it as a super nectar source. I don't know quite how common it is in your ponds. It's not actually very common in our ponds either, actually. But
I only found it in one pond. And it only ever was just kind of one plant. It didn't really expand much, but the water mint, I think that was part of the problem, is the water mint is what was doing so well there. So.
Yeah, and it may be as well, not quite, you know, quite the same, but you know, it's good in some respects. I mean, and I only just found out the other day that that marsh thistle was had been rated the #1 plant for attracting pollinators. I suspect we might have slightly more marsh thistle over this side of the country because it likes slightly more you know, upland conditions. And I mean, it's not, is it a macrophyte? I don't know, but it likes wet grassland anyway, that's for sure. And that's it, you know. Thistles are great.
Absolutely.
Interesting one from a landowner who has a tenant who's polluting one of the ponds by putting silage bales near them and farmyard muck and nitrates leaking into the field, asking what can he do without sort of coming foul of the law. I'm tricky on that, and it's not sort of it's just interesting to know that these are the sorts of challenges.
There's always lots of challenges, and it can be quite challenging because not everyone tends to care or think things through, or maybe they don't have the space elsewhere. I don't know. There's lots of different reasons. I would say if you want to protect the pond, the best thing you can do is expand the buffer zone around it, because all that grass, as much grassland as you can have around the pond, will absorb those nutrients, and it won't end up as much in the water column, which will help protect the water column from algae growth. It's not a surefire way, but it's one of the ways, and it also takes time. So,
well, I guess also that there's a bit of education needs to be done to the farmers, who I'm sure sometimes if they understood the importance of them, as you just, you know, pollinating the crops, then they wouldn't damage them so much. And I don't think it's a widespread thing, but it does happen. There's a few more messages coming in. Gareth Rees Roberts asks, any water irises in Norfolk ponds?
We had the yellow flag iris. A few ponds had yellow flag iris, and I certainly saw pollinators on them, but they weren't as used as some of the other plants. But there definitely was plenty, and this was more so at the managed ponds. The managed ponds tended to have the most yellow flag iris there.
This almost reinforces what you've been saying. Catherine Jansen says, thank you for the talk. What about newly created ponds? We have dragonflies and pollinators visiting and otters swimming in our new ponds made only a year and a half ago. Kind of illustrates the point that it sort of, certain early colonizers tend to come to new ponds straight.
Yes, certainly creating new ponds is important. We've lost a lot of ponds. It's estimated that we've probably lost over 800,000 ponds in the last 60, 70 years. So it's important to create new ponds to try and recreate this freshwater network that filled so much of this country in the past. But creating a new pond is different from kind of restoring a pond that's been there for a long time. You're going to get different plant species because especially if you're just letting it open to nature and you're not planting anything, which I would tend to advocate. Don't plant anything from a store because you don't know what kind of invasives you might get with that. But leaving it open to colonizers, you get lots of different types of pioneer species that move into these new ponds. Yes, you also are open to pollinators, but not pollinators, invasive species, but you're creating this very new situation. So you should be getting a lot of interesting pioneer species, and you're letting a pond develop its own identity rather than planting and telling it what it will be.
Absolutely.
So, which is very, again, each pond is unique and individual. So we need to encourage that because it helps, again, lift the countryside up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, on that amazing message, thank you so much, Richard. We'll wrap it up here.